He ruled the most dangerous criminal empire in the city, feared by enemies, obeyed by men who killed without hesitation. But on the night he threw his wife's most precious memories into the fire to impress his mistress, Dominic Moretti made the single worst mistake of his life. Vivian Hale didn't scream, she didn't beg. She walked away in silence and took everything with her. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, you already know how this ends. Stay until the last second. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The party had been Dominic's idea from the beginning. Not a celebration of anything specific. No birthday, no anniversary, no milestone worth marking. Just Dominic Moretti deciding on a Tuesday afternoon that he wanted people in his house that weekend, and by Saturday night, 300 of them had shown up without question. That was how things worked in his world. You didn't decline an invitation from Dominic Moretti. You showed up, you dressed well, you kept your voice down, and you thanked him for letting you stand in the same room. The Moretti estate sat at the northern edge of the city, separated from the rest of the neighborhood by iron gates, 12-foot hedges, and a security detail that rotated every 4 hours. The house itself was enormous and cold in the way that expensive things often are. Marble floors that clicked under every heel, chandeliers that threw too much light, rooms so large that conversations got swallowed before they reached the walls. Catering staff moved through the crowd with champagne and bruschetta. A jazz quartet played near the back terrace. Everywhere you looked, there were men in tailored suits pretending to enjoy themselves, and women in jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, pretending not to notice the tension underneath every handshake. Vivian Hale had not wanted this party. She'd said as much quietly, 2 days before, when Dominic had mentioned the guest list over breakfast. She'd looked at the names and said, "That's a lot of people for a Friday setup." And Dominic had looked back at her over his espresso cup and said, "It's Saturday, not Friday," as if that were the only thing worth correcting. She hadn't pushed. She rarely did, not anymore. There was a time earlier in the marriage when she'd pushed back on things. Small things, the kind of domestic friction that keeps a relationship honest. But that season had passed. She'd learned that pushing Dominic on the small things cost her something, and she'd decided years ago to save whatever leverage she had for the things that actually mattered. So she'd arranged the flowers herself. She'd handled the caterer when the original one fell through on Thursday morning. She'd reviewed the security rotation, adjusted the parking situation, spoken to the event coordinator about the lighting near the terrace because Dominic didn't like shadows on the food tables. She'd done all of it without a word of complaint, and by 8 o'clock Saturday night, she was standing near the bar in a charcoal silk dress, watching the room fill up and feeling the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from caring about things no one else notices. She looked from a distance like a woman at ease. That was the other thing she'd learned over the years, how to compose her face into something neutral and unreadable, the way you'd hold a very still hand of cards. Dominic was across the room, near the fireplace. That fireplace was the centerpiece of the main hall, stone-faced, wide enough to walk into, the kind of architectural statement that said money and permanence and legacy all at once. In winter, it ran constantly. Tonight, it had been lit for atmosphere, the flames low and orange, the heat rolling off it in soft waves that made the air nearby shimmer slightly. Dominic stood in front of it, the way he stood everywhere, like the room had been designed around him. He was talking to 3 men whose names Vivian knew from financial documents, men whose money moved through Moretti accounts and patterns she'd spent years learning to read. He laughed at something one of them said, the big open laugh he deployed at parties, the one that had nothing behind it. Beside him, close enough that it wasn't subtle, was Carla Voss. Vivian had known about Carla for 14 months. She hadn't been told. She'd found out the way she found out everything, through careful attention to detail and the kind of pattern recognition that came from managing complicated systems for a long time. A schedule that didn't quite add up. A charge on a secondary card that didn't match any business purpose she could identify. The way Dominic sometimes came home from meetings that weren't really meetings and showered immediately, before saying a word to anyone. She'd known for 14 months, and she hadn't done anything with that knowledge yet, because knowledge is only as useful as the moment you choose to deploy it. Carla was 31. She was beautiful in an aggressive, self-conscious way, the kind of woman who understood exactly what she looked like and had built her entire strategy around it. She worked, nominally, in the PR firm that handled two of Dominic's restaurant fronts, which was how they'd met, which was how these things usually started. Tonight she was wearing red, which was not an accident. She stood close to Dominic, touched his arm when she laughed, let her eyes move around the room in a slow sweep that settled, occasionally, on Vivian. Vivian watched this from across the room and felt nothing that surprised her. What she felt was closer to a kind of tired clarity, the feeling you get when something you've been waiting for finally begins to move. She turned back to the bar and asked for water. The man beside her, Marcus Lane, one of Dominic's oldest associates, a heavy-set man with gray at his temples who had always been decent to her, leaned slightly in her direction without looking at her directly. "You holding up all right?" he said, under the noise of the room. "Fine," she said. "The crab cakes are excellent. You should try them before they're gone." Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He moved away. She'd noticed that Marcus had been moving away from Dominic's side more often lately. Not dramatically. Just with a slightly longer delay in his responses during meetings, a posture that had shifted from forward-leaning to neutral. She filed that away the same way she filed everything, in the back of her mind where she kept the things that might eventually matter. The night moved the way these nights always did, loudly at first, then finding its own uncomfortable rhythm. Vivian circulated because it was expected, because people wanted to speak with her, because she was still, technically, the woman who ran this household and organized this event, and knew every person in this room by name and connection. She spoke to the wife of a city councilman and remembered to ask about her daughter's recital. She spoke to a real estate developer who was 6 months into a deal with one of Dominic's holding companies and said exactly enough to keep him comfortable without saying anything that could be quoted later. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was the part of the life that had come most naturally to her, the diplomacy, the navigation, the way of making complicated people feel like the room was simpler than it was. At some point past 10, she went upstairs. Not to retire. Too early for that, and it would have been noticed. She went up because she'd left her phone in the bedroom and because she wanted, if she was being honest with herself, 2 minutes away from the noise. The bedroom was dark and quiet. She didn't turn on the light. She stood at the window for a moment and looked down at the terrace, where a handful of guests had drifted outside with their drinks, and the city lights were faint on the horizon behind the property line. On the dresser, beside a small lamp she hadn't switched on, was the box. It was a simple thing. Lacquered wood, the size of a large hardback book, the corners slightly worn. Her mother had kept it in the kitchen of the house where Vivian grew up, and after both parents were gone, her mother from illness, her father a year later, from what the family quietly understood was grief wearing the shape of a second stroke, it had come to Vivian. Inside were photographs. Not the digital kind, not the kind you could restore from a backup or print again from a file. Physical photographs, the paper kind. Some of them going back 40 years. Her parents at the shore the summer before they married. Her father with hair she'd never seen in real life, thick and dark, standing next to a car he'd been proud of. Her mother holding Vivian as an infant, squinting slightly in the light, smiling the way you smile when someone asks you to smile and you're also genuinely happy. There were photographs of grandparents she barely remembered, a cousin's wedding, a Christmas that seemed to exist in a different century. All of it irreplaceable, the way the past is irreplaceable. Not because you can't survive without it, but because its specific texture, the weight of it, the color, the grain of old photography paper, cannot be reproduced by any means available to living people. She pressed her palm to the top of the box for a moment, a thing she did sometimes without thinking, and then picked up her phone and went back downstairs. She didn't notice, when she left the room, that Carla Voss had come up the stairs 2 minutes behind her. She found out what had happened at 11:47. She knew the exact time because she'd just checked her watch, a thin silver thing her mother had worn every day for 20 years, thinking she needed to begin moving people toward the door within the next half hour. She was standing near the hallway to the kitchen when she heard it. Not loud, not in the way a confrontation is loud. More the sound of a room changing temperature. A ripple of quiet spreading outward from the fireplace. She moved through the crowd the way water moves around objects, not pushing, just finding the path of least resistance, and reached the edge of the small circle that had formed near the hearth. Carla was there first in her vision. The woman was flushed, animated, the kind of energy that reads as either elation or cruelty depending on the context. She was holding something, and it took Vivian a beat to understand what she was looking at. The box. Carla had brought it downstairs. It was open in her hands, and she was saying something to the people nearest to her, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone performing for an audience. "I found this upstairs," she was saying, in the tone you'd use if you'd stumbled across something mildly absurd. "Old photos, stacks of them. I mean, who keeps paper photographs anymore?" She tilted the box and let the images fan slightly, the way you'd hold a deck of cards. Very sentimental. Very, I don't know, housewifey. Several people near her laughed. The nervous kind of laugh, the kind that comes from being close to power and not wanting to be on the wrong side of the moment. Vivian didn't move yet. She was still processing. There was a sensation in her chest that was very cold and very specific, like a blade placed flat against skin. Not cutting, not yet, just the pressure of cold metal and the understanding of what it could do. Dominic was 3 feet away from Carla, holding his drink, and he was watching this with the expression he wore when something amused him. Half smile, eyes narrow, waiting to see how far the thing would go. Not stopping it, watching. That was the moment Vivian understood, fully and without question, what the dynamic in this room was. Carla was performing for Dominic. She was demonstrating something, daring, ownership, the willingness to cross a line that other women wouldn't cross. And Dominic, in not stopping her, was signaling his approval, was rewarding it. Vivian stepped forward. "I'll take that," she said. Her voice came out even. She was surprised, distantly, by how even it came out. Carla turned to look at her. The expression on the woman's face was something Vivian would think about later. Not malicious, exactly, but lit from inside with a kind of triumph that required an audience to be worth anything. "Oh, is this yours?" Carla said, as if she genuinely hadn't known, as if she'd just stumbled into this moment by accident. "Sorry, I just thought it was, they're just old photos." "They're my family," Vivian said. "Give me the box." The room had gone quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when something real is happening amid something staged. People nearby had stopped their conversations. The jazz quartet had reached the end of a number and paused between pieces. In the gap, the fire crackled. Carla glanced at Dominic, and Dominic set down his drink. Vivian watched him. She had been watching him for 11 years, across dinner tables, across contracts, across the good years, and the long, flat years, and the years that were simply endurance. She knew how he moved when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed, and how he moved when he was improvising. What she saw now was something she hadn't quite seen before. A decision being made in real time, something deliberate being constructed right in front of her. He was choosing. She could see him choosing. He took the box from Carla's hands. For 1 second, 1 second that Vivian would replay later, she thought he was going to hand it to her. Thought he'd finally found the line he wouldn't cross, that the room full of witnesses and the basic calculus of a marriage and an empire would bring him back from whatever edge he was standing on. He turned toward the fireplace. "Dom," she said. Just the name. Quiet. He opened the box and tilted it forward, and all the photographs fell into the fire at once. The sound they made was almost nothing, a soft rush of paper hitting flame, a brief flare of light as edges caught, and then they were burning, the images going white, and then black, and curling at the edges, 40 years of her family's life becoming ash in a fireplace that had been lit for atmosphere. The room was completely still. Vivian stood and watched the photographs burn. Her mother's face, her father's hair, the shore where they'd stood before they were married, the Christmas she'd never see again in any form. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. Dominic turned back to the room with the expression of a man who had just demonstrated something. His eyes found Vivian's, and what she saw in them wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was the easy confidence of a man who had never once believed the person in front of him would make him pay for anything. "You're upset," he said. "We can get new photos printed." There was a beat of silence in which the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then someone nearby laughed, and the jazz quartet started playing again, and the party continued. Vivian turned and walked to the kitchen. Marcel. She didn't cry. That was the thing she noticed most about herself in the hours that followed. Not the absence of screaming or throwing things, which she'd never been prone to, but the specific absence of tears. She stood in the kitchen with the staff still moving around her and felt the place in her chest where the grief should have been, and found instead something that was perfectly, absolutely calm. The kind of calm that comes after a decision has been made so completely that emotion becomes irrelevant. She helped close down the party. She thanked the catering staff. She spoke briefly to two guests who hadn't wanted to leave, and who seemed not to notice that anything had happened or were pretending not to. By 1 in the morning, the house was quiet. By 1:30, she was in the study, not the bedroom, sitting at the desk with a single lamp on. She opened the middle drawer and took out a yellow legal pad and started writing. She wrote for 3 hours. Not a letter. Something more structured than that. More like a list that kept branching into other lists. Things she knew. Accounts she'd had access to since the second year of the marriage, when Dominic had handed her the financial oversight of 4 businesses because he trusted her judgment more than anyone on his payroll. Agreements she'd reviewed and, in some cases, quietly restructured with the help of Philip Tanaka, a corporate attorney who'd been her contact for 7 years, and whose loyalty was not to Dominic's name, but to the quality of the work she brought him. Properties whose deeds she'd insured were held in structures that Dominic had never fully understood because he hadn't cared to, because the understanding of these things was her department and always had been. She wrote down the name of every person who'd called her in the past year to ask her to intercede with Dominic on one issue or another. Investors, city officials, 2 men who sat on the board of a nonprofit Dominic used as a public face. People who dealt with Dominic through her because dealing with him directly was impossible, and they'd learned that she was the one who could translate what they needed into something he'd accept. She wrote for a long time. When she was done, she read through what she'd written. Then she turned to a new page and wrote 3 words at the top. What comes next? Dominic came to bed at 2:45. She knew because she heard him in the hallway, heard the bathroom, heard the distinctive sound of him getting into bed and being asleep in under 4 minutes the way he always was. The sleep of a man who had never once lain awake worrying about anything. She sat in the study until 5 in the morning. Then she went upstairs, showered, dressed in the gray wool suit she wore to financial meetings, and came back down to the kitchen. Made coffee. Stood at the window over the sink and watched the light change on the back lawn, the slow shift from blue-black to ash-gray to the first thin color of morning. At 7:15, Dominic came downstairs. He was in his robe, unshaven, carrying the ease of a man who had slept well. He saw her at the kitchen counter and said, "You're up early," and poured himself coffee from the carafe she'd already made. She turned from the window. On the counter, beside his coffee cup, was an envelope, heavy paper, the kind law offices used. "What's this?" he said, picking it up. "Read it," she said. He looked at her, then at the envelope. He set down his cup and opened the envelope and took out the document inside and read the first page, then the second. His expression shifted in a way she'd never quite seen before. Not anger, not yet. Something preceding anger. The look of a man who has encountered something he didn't predict. "You're not serious," he said. "I'm filing it Monday," she said. "Philip already has everything. I wanted you to see the paperwork before it became official." Vivian. He said her name the way you'd say the name of a person who'd lost their footing on stairs, trying to reach them, trying to slow the fall. "Last night was... I made a mistake. The photographs, we can talk about this." "We don't need to talk about it," she said. "You're going to blow up 11 years over some photographs." She picked up her coffee. "I'm going to end a marriage that's been over for a long time," she said, "because someone finally made it clear enough that I didn't have to pretend otherwise anymore." His face changed again, the pretense of concern falling away, replaced by something harder. "You think you can walk away from what we have built? You think you have any idea what this marriage actually is?" "I think I have a better idea than you do," she said. He laughed, the short, dismissive sound he used when he wanted to suggest that someone was being irrational. "You'll come back," he said. "Give it a week. You'll realize what you're walking away from, and you'll come back." She looked at him for a moment. 11 years of marriage looked back at her. The good years, the early years when she'd believed in him, when his ambition had seemed like something they were building together rather than something she was simply servicing. The years that followed, the slow and almost imperceptible shift from partnership to utility, the way she'd become, over time, not his wife, but his infrastructure. "Goodbye, Dominic," she said. She picked up her bag, which she'd packed the night before, and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him say something else. She didn't catch all of it, caught only the tone, which was still confident, still assured, still the voice of a man who had not yet understood what he'd done. She did not turn around. The door closed behind her. The morning air was cold and clean. She got into the car that Philip had arranged, which was waiting at the far end of the driveway, past the gatehouse. She did not look back at the house. Philip Tanaka was 61 years old, slight, with glasses and a habit of pressing the tips of his fingers together when he was thinking. His office was in a building downtown that looked unremarkable from the outside and was, on the inside, one of the most effective corporate law practices in the state. He'd been handling Vivian's quiet work for 7 years, the work Dominic had authorized without really examining it, the work that had been described to him in general terms and signed off on because he trusted Vivian's management and because the outcomes always made money. He stood when she came in and did not offer condolences or pleasantries. "The filing is ready," he said. "I wanted to walk through the asset inventory with you before we proceed." She sat down across from him and placed her hands flat on the table. "Walk me through it," she said. What followed was 3 hours of detailed review. Philip had prepared a document 70 pages long, indexed and cross-referenced, covering every holding that had been structured through the entities Vivian had managed. Some of it was straightforward, properties in her name or in jointly held structures that would split cleanly. Some of it was more complicated, the result of years of careful arrangement. Businesses that Dominic had funded but that had been legally organized in ways that gave Vivian operational and, in some cases, majority control. Accounts and holding structures she'd built with conservative, deliberate intent. A portion of the investment portfolio, the legitimate side, that had been documented with her as the decision-maker of record because she had been the decision-maker, because Dominic had handed that responsibility to her completely and had simply signed what she brought him. "He's going to say he didn't understand what he was signing," Vivian said at one point. "He's going to be right," Philip said without looking up from the page. "That's not going to help him." She nodded. "How much of the organization do you think is actually aware of the extent of your involvement?" Philip asked. "Enough," she said. "The ones who matter. The ones who actually run the day-to-day of the legitimate side. Marcus, the property managers, the people at Crestfield Financial. They've all been dealing with me for years. Dominic's the name on the door, but the relationships are mine." Philip set down his pen and looked at her. "This is going to be messy," he said. "For him." "I know. You understand there may be... He may not respond rationally when the full picture becomes clear." "He won't respond rationally," she said. "He never has. That's not the variable I'm worried about." "What variable are you worried about?" She thought about it for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved. Cars, people, the ordinary machinery of mourning. "Making sure I don't leave anything behind that I haven't accounted for," she said. "I've been careful for a long time. I don't want one thing I missed to undo it." Philip looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the professional version of respect, which is attention. "There's one thing," he said. She waited. "The Aldermore Partnership," he said. "The agreement he signed in 2019. The one with the arbitration clause. It has a carve-out that could complicate the commercial property split." She nodded slowly. "I remember the clause. I flagged it at the time, and he didn't want to renegotiate." "It was your flag," Philip said. "I have it in writing." "Use it," she said. The divorce papers reached Dominic's attorney on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Vivian's phone had received 6 calls from Dominic's number, which she did not answer. By Monday evening, she had received a call from a number she recognized as one of Dominic's men. Not a threat, just a message relayed that Dominic wanted to meet, to talk, to work something out. She listened to the message twice and then deleted it. She was staying at the apartment she'd quietly maintained for 2 years in a building across town. Nothing dramatic, a 2-bedroom with a view of a parking structure, and past that, a strip of the river. She'd told Dominic it was a corporate apartment for business guests. It was technically held under a corporate entity. It had, for the past 8 months, had her things in the closet and her name on the lease in a structure that was simply well organized enough that he hadn't bothered to look closely. That night, she sat on the couch in the apartment and ate delivery food and watched the river lights from the window. She thought about the photographs. She thought about her mother's face in the specific way you think about something you know you're never going to see again, which is differently from how you think about something that is simply absent. It is a different quality of loss. The photographs were ash. The specific texture of her father's expression in that old car photograph, the particular way the light had fallen on her mother's shoulders on that shore, those things were gone from the world now, not lost, but eliminated, and she sat with that for a while, giving it the weight it deserved. She didn't cry. She still didn't cry. What she felt, sitting there in the quiet apartment with the city moving outside, was the particular weight of a decision that had already been made, not the anguish of making it, which she'd bypassed entirely, but the steady, serious consequence of the aftermath. She had been building toward this moment for longer than she'd consciously admitted. What Dominic had done on Saturday night with the photographs had not created the ending. He'd simply removed the last reason she'd had for delaying it. Her phone buzzed, a text from Philip. 2 words. Meeting confirmed. She put the phone down and looked at the river. Somewhere across the city, Dominic was in his house, so her house. The house she'd organized and maintained and arranged in every detail for 11 years. And he was almost certainly still confident that this was going to resolve itself in a way that favored him. He had never experienced an outcome that didn't. He had built his entire identity on the assumption that his will was simply the shape that reality took. She knew something he didn't know yet. She knew that everything he'd built, not the violence, not the underground machinery that had never been her domain, but the legitimate architecture of the empire, the businesses, the investments, the political access, the financial infrastructure, that half of his world ran on her. Not as a detail, as a load-bearing structure. He didn't know it yet because he'd never had to know it. She had made herself invisible on purpose, the way anything that works well becomes invisible, because the best infrastructure is the kind you only notice when it's gone. He was about to notice. On Thursday of that week, she received a call from Marcus Lane. He asked if she'd be available to meet. She said yes. He named a diner 3 miles from downtown, somewhere unremarkable, and she went at 10 in the morning and found him already there with coffee and the expression of a man who had been thinking hard about something for several days. "I'm not here to ask you to go back," he said, before she'd settled into the seat. "Good," she said. "I'm here because—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been with Dominic for 22 years, you know that." "I know. And in 22 years there have been things I've done that I'm not proud of." He said it plainly, not looking for absolution, just stating a fact. "I've made my peace with most of it, but—" He looked at her. "He's not going to take this well. And some of what he might do, I'm aware of the risks," she said. "I want to make sure you're Marcus." She said his name with enough gentleness to stop him without dismissing him. "I spent 11 years calculating every variable in that man's orbit. I have not made a single move in the past 72 hours without 3 contingencies behind it." She paused. "I'm all right. What I need to know is whether you're going to be." He looked at her for a long time. "He's going to figure out what he lost," Marcus said, finally. "And when he does, he already lost it," she said. "He lost it Saturday night. He just doesn't understand the scope yet." Marcus picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "There are people on the inside who—" he started and then caught himself. "Let me just say there are people who've been waiting to see which way this goes. And now they'll see," she said. He nodded slowly. "Are you one of them?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, 22 years is a long time to back the wrong horse." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to back anyone. I'm asking you to tell me honestly where you stand." Marcus Lane, who had made his living and his reputation in a world where nothing was ever stated plainly, looked at her across a table in a diner and said plainly, "I think you knew this ship before he did, and I think there are more of us who've known it longer than he realizes." Vivian said nothing. She picked up her coffee. Outside the diner window, the city moved through an ordinary morning, cars and people, and the unremarkable current of daily life. In an office downtown, Philip Tanaka was preparing documents that would begin, piece by piece, to reveal the actual architecture of Dominic Moretti's empire. Not the violent machinery he'd built on fear, but the legitimate structure he'd built on Vivian. Dominic was in his house, probably, making calls, probably still confident. He didn't know yet what was waiting for him when the legal filings became public record and his investors started receiving calls they hadn't expected. He didn't know which names were on which documents or which relationships were actually hers, or what the specific and concrete shape of his dependency on her turned out to be when you laid it flat on a table and read it line by line. By Thursday evening, the first of those calls would be made. By the following Monday, 3 investors who had been doing business with Dominic for years would have spoken with Philip Tanaka's office, not because anyone had pressured them, simply because, now that the structure was shifting, they were following the relationship that had actually worked, the one that had returned their calls, remembered their concerns, and delivered on what it promised. The fire had taken 40 years of photographs, but Vivian Hale had spent 11 years building something that fire couldn't touch, and in the days ahead, Dominic Moretti was going to understand, for the first time and far too late, exactly what he had dismissed, and what he had thrown away, and what the true cost of that fireplace moment was going to be. He thought it was over. He had no idea it had just begun. And somewhere in the wreckage of what was coming, in the investor calls and the legal filings, and the slow collapse of everything that had required her to function, Carla Voss was standing beside him, red dress and confidence and the absolute certainty that she was about to become the queen of something. She didn't know yet what she was actually about to inherit. None of them did. The first call came on Thursday at 9:43 in the morning. Dominic was in his office on the second floor of the estate, the room he used for actual business rather than the performative one downstairs where he met people he wanted to impress. This office was smaller, darker, a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out on the side yard where nobody went. He was on the phone with his attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had been handling Moretti legal matters for 16 years, and who had, in that time, developed the particular verbal texture of someone constantly managing bad news with good diction. "The filing is clean," Gerald was saying. "There's nothing irregular about the paperwork itself. The question is the asset structure." "What about it?" Dominic said. "Several of the holdings, the Linden Avenue commercial block, the Crestfield accounts, the Harmon Street mixed use, they're held in entities where Vivian is listed as the primary operational authority." "That's administrative," Dominic said. "She handled the paperwork." "That's all that is." There was a pause on Gerald's end that lasted just long enough to be meaningful. "Dominic, I've reviewed the documentation, the way these entities are structured, the operating agreements, the signatory authorities. This is not administrative. This is legal control." Dominic was quiet. "She's been your co-architect on the legitimate side," Gerald said, choosing the word carefully. "Not a manager, an architect." "She managed things I told her to manage," Dominic said. His voice was flat. "That's not what the documents say." Dominic set down the pen he'd been holding. He hadn't realized he'd been gripping it. "Fix it." "I can't fix documents that were legally executed over a period of years," Gerald said. "Dominic, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. If she moves to enforce her position in these structures, she won't. She already has. Philip Tanaka's office contacted Crestfield yesterday afternoon, and the Linden Avenue property manager. They're not making demands yet. They're just establishing contact, making it clear." Dominic stood up from the desk. "Gerald," he said, "get in front of this." "I'm trying to tell you that getting in front of it requires understanding how far back it goes," Gerald said. "I need 3 days to do a full review of every entity she had operational involvement in." "You have until Monday." "Dominic, Monday," he said, and hung up. He stood at the window looking out at the side yard where the morning light was coming through the hedges in thin strips. His jaw was tight. He could feel the tightness in his back teeth, the particular physical sensation of something going wrong that he wasn't yet willing to call by its name. He had not, in 23 years of running this organization, lost a negotiation he'd initiated. He had lost fights, had taken losses on specific deals, had absorbed setbacks that would have destroyed smaller men. But a negotiation he'd started from a position of power? Never. He was having trouble locating clearly and precisely what his position of power actually was in this particular situation. He didn't stay with that thought for long. He'd never been comfortable with uncertainty, and his response to it had always been the same. Movement, action, find the thing you can push on and push. He called Carla. She answered on the second ring. She was somewhere bright. He could hear it in the acoustic quality of the space, somewhere with windows and echoes, not her apartment. "Are you in the building?" he said. "I'm at the gym," she said. "What's wrong?" "Come to the house. Now." A beat. "Dominic, it's 10 in the morning. "I know what time it is," he said. "Come to the house." Carla arrived at 11:15 in gym clothes and a leather jacket, her hair pulled back, looking freshly annoyed in the way she sometimes looked when she'd been interrupted from something she was enjoying. She came into the main hall and found Dominic there rather than in his office, standing near the fireplace. The same one, the ashes long since cleaned out, and the grate reset. And something in her registered the location and then dismissed it. "What happened?" she said. "Sit down." "I don't want to sit down." He looked at her. She met the look and held it, which was one of the things he'd liked about her in the beginning. She didn't flinch. He'd taken it for strength. He was beginning to wonder if it was simply the absence of a correct read on the situation. "The divorce filing," he said. "Her attorney has been contacting people." Carla's expression shifted slightly. "So, let him." "It's not a standard asset division," Dominic said. There are structures, legal arrangements, from when she was managing the businesses." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that give her significant control over the legitimate holdings." Carla stared at him. Then something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. It was fast, and she replaced it with concern, but it had been there, a flicker of something closer to calculation than shock. "How significant?" she asked. "Significant enough that Gerald spent 40 minutes trying to explain it to me." "Gerald is always catastrophizing." "Gerald is not catastrophizing," Dominic said. His voice came out harder than he'd intended. Carla registered it. She went still in the way she went still when she was deciding something. "This is real," he said. "She spent years building this." "Building what, exactly?" "A legal position." He said it the way you say something that you're still processing the reality of. "Inside my own organization." The room was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, kitchen staff were moving around, the muffled sound of ordinary life continuing. "She was always the smartest person in the room," Carla said, finally. Her voice had shifted. Quieter. Something in it that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite the opposite. "Don't," Dominic said. "Don't do that right now." Carla crossed her arms. She stood near the door of the main hall with the morning light on her face and said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just saying, you gave her that access. You trusted her with all of it. I'm not saying that's a mistake. I'm saying, I know what you're saying. She was your wife for 11 years, and she was running your—" Carla. The name landed like a hand on a flat surface. Flat and final. She stopped. He looked at her. "Why did you bring the box down?" Silence. "Saturday night," he said, "the photographs." "Why did you bring the box downstairs?" She uncrossed her arms. The shift in her posture was small but legible. I found it upstairs and I thought, "What did you think?" "I thought it would be funny." "Funny," he repeated. "Dominic, I didn't know she was going to—" "You did it to make a point," he said. "In front of my people, in my house, you made a point to my wife." Carla's jaw tightened. And you backed me up, she said. You're the one who put them in the fire. I didn't do that. That was you. The thing about that statement was that it was completely true. That was the part that made it land the way it did. Not like an accusation, but like a door swinging open onto something he'd rather not look at directly. He had done that. He had picked up the box and he had made a choice. And the choice had felt, in the moment, like authority, like the clean expression of a priority. It had felt, in the moment, like control. It had not been control. He understood that now in a way he hadn't fully understood it on Saturday night. What he had done on Saturday night was hand Vivian Hale the one thing she'd been waiting for. Not a reason to leave, she'd had reasons. She'd clearly had reasons for longer than he'd known, but a reason she didn't have to justify. A public act, witnessed, undeniable, something she could hold up against everything else and say, this is when. No one could argue with it. Not her, not him, not Gerald, not a judge. He had handed her the cleanest exit she could possibly have had. He turned away from Carla and walked to the window. "What are you going to do?" she said behind him. "I'm going to find out exactly how exposed I am," he said, "and then I'm going to make decisions." "And me?" she said. He didn't answer right away. Outside, the lawn was bright and damp, and the gardener's truck was parked at the far end, near the gate. An ordinary morning doing ordinary things around the edges of a situation that was not ordinary at all. "Go back to the gym," he said. He heard her intake of breath, the decision she made in the silence that followed, not to push, the sound of her footsteps crossing the hall, the door. He stood at the window for a long time after she left. Sank. The call from Marco Renetti came on Friday. Marco was a developer, 60 years old, third-generation money that had found its way into a partnership with Moretti Holdings on 2 commercial projects in the east side of the city. He was not, by nature, a confrontational man. He was the kind of man who preferred that everything be resolved at the handshake level before anything became formal. He called Dominic's cell directly, which was itself unusual. Marco usually went through channels. "I wanted to call you personally," Marco said when Dominic picked up. "Man to man, before anything goes further." "Go ahead," Dominic said. "I had a call from Philip Tanaka's office yesterday," Marco said, "about the Kenmore partnership." Dominic's stomach tightened. The Kenmore partnership was an $18 million commercial development, 2 years into a 5-year investment cycle. "That's a Moretti entity," Dominic said. "What interest does Tanaka have in it?" "That's the thing I wanted to clarify with you," Marco said. He spoke carefully, the way men speak when they're doing someone a courtesy they don't strictly owe. "Because based on the partnership agreement, the Moretti entity that holds the interest, the operating authority in that entity is Vivian." Dominic said nothing. "Now, I want to be clear," Marco continued. "I have nothing against you. We've done good business. But I've also been dealing with Vivian directly on this project for 2 years. She's the one who knows the development schedule, who managed the architectural review, who has the relationship with the city planning office on this particular permit issue we've been navigating." A pause. "Dominic, if she's walking away from the organization, I need to know who I'm dealing with. And right now, legally, what I'm looking at says I'm dealing with her." "You're dealing with me," Dominic said. His voice was low. "You've always been dealing with me." "I understand that's how you see it," Marco said, with the gentleness of a man delivering a verdict. "But that's not what the paperwork says. And I have a fiduciary responsibility to my own investors." Another pause. "I'm not choosing sides, Dominic. I'm just following the documents." Following the documents. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was a breach of conduct he'd never committed in a business call before. He stood in the kitchen of his own house holding a phone that had just delivered the 4th significant piece of bad news in 2 days. And he felt something he hadn't felt since he was 23 years old and had nothing, which was the specific cold sensation of the ground being less solid than you'd been standing on it. He set the phone down. He needed to think. He called a meeting for Saturday morning. Not the full organization, just the inner circle, the 6 men who actually knew the shape of things. They came to the house at 9. They sat around the dining table which had hosted dinners for senators and judges and men whose names appeared in newspapers, and they looked at Dominic and waited. He laid it out plainly, which was not his natural mode, but which was the only available option when Gerald sat to his left with a summary document and the faces around the table already knew something was wrong. He told them about the asset structures, about Crestfield, about Kenmore, about the number of legitimate holdings where Vivian had been, quietly and legally, more than an administrator. The room was quiet. Then Ray Dobbins, 54, broad, a man who had been with Dominic for 18 years and who Dominic had always considered unshakable, said, "How much are we talking about? Total." Gerald cleared his throat. "In terms of the legitimate holdings where her operational authority creates a legal complication, just a number," Ray said. Gerald looked at Dominic. Dominic nodded. "Depending on how the arbitration clause in the Aldermore agreement resolves," Gerald said, "somewhere between 38 and 45% of the legal asset base." Silence. Thomas Kelk, who sat at the far end of the table and who never spoke first, said quietly, "That's nearly half." "That's what I said," Gerald said. Nobody looked at Dominic directly. They looked at the table, at their hands, at Gerald's document. The specific choreography of men who are processing something they hadn't expected and who are uncertain, for the first time in a long time, what the appropriate response looks like. Ray said, "And she's not negotiating." "She's not negotiating," Dominic said. "What does she want?" "What's hers?" Dominic said. The words came out of his mouth and hung in the air, and he heard them in the way you hear something you've said that you can't take back. Ray leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, made a sound that wasn't a word. Thomas Kells said, "We need to understand if there's exposure on the other side. The non-legitimate operations, is there any documentation trail that—" "No," Dominic said. "She stayed out of that completely. Always." "You're sure?" "I'm sure," he said. And he was. Whatever else Vivian had done, whatever the quiet architecture of her position inside his empire had turned out to be, she had never touched the other side, had never wanted to, had made it clear in the early years that her involvement had limits and had kept those limits exactly. He had read that, at the time, as squeamishness. He was reading it now as something else entirely. She'd kept herself clean. Deliberately, methodically, over 11 years, she'd built a position that was legally defensible, financially significant, and completely free of anything that could be used against her. He sat at the head of his table, in his house, with 6 men who worked for him, and who were all quietly, behind their careful expressions, recalculating, and he felt the full cold weight of 11 years of not paying attention settle into his chest like something that was never going to move again. After the meeting, when everyone else had gone, Marcus stayed. He sat in the chair closest to Dominic's end of the table and didn't say anything for a while. The room smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke from Ray, who'd stepped outside halfway through. The morning had turned gray outside the windows. "Say it," Dominic said. Marcus looked at him. "I'm not here to say anything." "You stayed." "I stayed because I wanted to make sure you were all right." Dominic laughed. Just once, short, the kind that isn't humor. 22 years, and you're asking if I'm all right. 22 years, and I've never seen you sit at that table looking like that, Marcus said. "So yeah." Dominic put his elbows on the table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The gesture was so unlike him, so unlike anything he'd ever done in front of anyone, that Marcus went still. "She knew," Dominic said, not asking, just saying it. "She's always known," Marcus said. "You know that." "I mean, she knew about Carla." Marcus said nothing. "For how long?" Dominic said. "I don't know for certain." "How long, Marcus?" A pause. "A while," Marcus said. "I'd guess more than a year." Dominic took his hands away from his face, looked at the table. "And she didn't do anything." "She did something," Marcus said. "She just didn't do it the way you would have." Dominic absorbed that. "She was waiting," he said. Not surprised, just following it to where it led. "She was building," Marcus said quietly. The distinction landed somewhere in Dominic's chest and didn't leave. Not waiting, building. While he'd been running the organization the way he'd always run it, on momentum and fear and the assumption that his position was self-sustaining, she had been quietly, precisely, building the architecture of a future that didn't include him. Not out of spite, out of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from deciding, at some specific moment he couldn't identify, that the situation was what it was, and the only question worth asking was what to do about it. He had always believed he was the most patient man in the room. He had been in a room with someone more patient for 11 years, and he had never once seen it. Marcus stood up, put a hand briefly on Dominic's shoulder, a thing he'd never done before in 2 decades of association, and then walked toward the door. "Marcus," Dominic said. The man stopped. "Where do you stand?" Dominic said. Marcus turned halfway. His expression was the most honest Dominic had seen it in years. Not calculating, not managed, just tired and clear. "I stand where I've always stood," he said, "which is with whoever I believe is going to hold this together." A pause. "And right now I'm not sure that's you." He left. Dominic sat alone at the head of the table. On Monday morning at 8:51, Gerald Foss called with news that changed the geography of everything. Philip Tanaka's office had filed a motion regarding the Aldermore arbitration clause, not the direction Gerald had anticipated, not the direction that Dominic had half convinced himself might still go his way. The arbitration clause, it turned out, had a secondary provision. Buried in language that Dominic had approved in 2019 without reading, that Vivian had flagged, and that Gerald, reviewing the file now, found a notation confirming she had specifically suggested be included. The secondary provision, in the event of a dissolution of the primary partnership structure, which a divorce and asset division qualified as under the agreement's terms, gave the operational authority holder the right of first refusal on the commercial property assets before any forced sale. Vivian held the operational authority. She had written the clause. She had 7 years ago put the clause in place. "She planned this," Dominic said when Gerald finished reading. "I don't think she planned the divorce," Gerald said carefully, "but she structured things, well, comprehensively, in a way that ensured she would never be without options." Dominic stood in his office with the phone against his ear and felt the specific sensation of a man standing on something he'd believed was solid and discovering, too late, that it had always been water. "File the response," he said. Filing the response puts us in formal litigation. At that point, it becomes public record." "File it anyway." "Dominic, the moment this goes into public record, every investor and every legitimate holding is going to have access to the asset structure. The people who don't already know will know. And then they'll know," Dominic said. "File it." Gerald filed it. By Tuesday afternoon, a journalist with the city's largest business publication had filed a records request. By Tuesday evening, Carla Voss had called Dominic 4 times. He did not answer. He sat in his office in the dark. He hadn't turned the lights on when the sun went down, and had not noticed until the room was completely black. And he thought about a box of photographs burning in a fireplace, and the face of the woman who had watched them burn, and the way she had not screamed, had not cried, had not done anything at all except go very still, in the way of something that has made a decision so complete that nothing on the outside can reach it anymore. He thought about that stillness, and for the first time, sitting in the dark in the house he'd built, and that was now half hers by law and entirely hers in every way that functioned, he felt the shape of what he'd actually destroyed. Not the photographs, not the marriage. Something older and quieter and harder to name. The kind of thing a man only understands he had when it's completely, finally, and irreversibly gone. His phone rang. Not Carla this time. The number on the screen was one he recognized as belonging to a city official. A man who had been, for 6 years, one of Dominic's most reliable political contacts. A man whose cooperation Dominic had always assumed was permanent. He picked up. "Dominic," the man said. His voice had a quality in it that hadn't been there the last time they'd spoken. A distance. A careful neutrality. The sound of someone standing just slightly further back than usual. "I've been seeing some news about the business situation. I just wanted to call and say, we should probably talk before things develop further." "Talk about what?" Dominic said. "About the nature of our arrangement," the official said. "Going forward, because the person I've been—" A pause, with something inside it. "The primary contact I've been dealing with, for city planning, for the permit process, that's been Vivian, and if that changes—" It doesn't change, Dominic said. Dominic, the official said, she's not in your organization anymore. The line was quiet. I think, the official said, we should probably have a different kind of conversation than we've been having. Dominic said nothing. I'll have my assistant reach out, the official said, and ended the call. Dominic set the phone on his desk. In the darkness of his office, in the house that was no longer the thing it had been, with 6 days of phone calls and documents and recalculating faces, he understood, fully and for the first time without anything softening it, that there was no version of this that ended the way he'd assumed it would. He had believed on Sunday morning, handing her the envelope with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome. He had believed she would be back within a week. She was not coming back. And what was coming instead, in the form of legal filings and business publication records requests, and city officials calling with new tones in their voices, was something he had no instrument for measuring, because he had spent 11 years believing that what he'd built was held together by his name and his will and his capacity for force. And the truth, the actual structural truth, had been standing next to him every day in a gray wool suit, filing documents, managing relationships, inserting clauses into agreements he hadn't read, and waiting, with the particular patience of someone who has decided but not yet acted, for the moment that would make everything possible. The moment he had given her, with his own hands, in front of 300 witnesses. His phone lit up again. Carla, the 5th time. He turned the phone face down on the desk and sat in the dark and did not answer it. And outside the window, the city went on without him, indifferent as it had always been, counting nothing, waiting for nothing, simply moving forward the way things move when the people at the center of them have finally, irreversibly, run out of ground. The business publication ran the story on Wednesday morning. It was not, by the standards of investigative journalism, a particularly aggressive piece. The reporter, a woman named Diane Cho, who covered commercial real estate and corporate litigation for the city desk, had written it carefully, the way reporters write when they have solid documents and don't need to editorialize. She let the structure speak. The headline was straightforward. Moretti Holdings divorce filing reveals complex asset architecture. The subhead, wife of prominent developer holds operational authority in nearly half of legitimate portfolio. Dominic read it at 6:40 in the morning on his phone, sitting at the kitchen counter in yesterday's clothes. He'd slept 3 hours on the couch in his office and come down for coffee and found the article already waiting, already shared 11 times in his industry contacts networks, already the subject of 2 text messages from men whose names he recognized and whose silence, until this morning, he'd taken for loyalty. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down and poured his coffee and stood at the window and looked at the lawn and thought about nothing for a full 2 minutes, which was the closest he ever came to going blank. The article didn't reveal anything he didn't already know. That was the particular cruelty of it. Every fact was a fact he'd spent the past week absorbing in Gerald's office or over the phone in the dark. But seeing it assembled in print, clean, sourced, publicly accessible, was a different category of experience. It made it real in a way that internal knowledge doesn't. You can manage internal knowledge. You can revise it, contextualize it, tell yourself the shape of it is smaller than it is. Public record doesn't give you that. His phone started ringing at 6:58. He let it ring. By 8 o'clock, he had 14 missed calls and a text from Ray Dobbins that said only, "We need to talk today." Not a question. He called Gerald first. Gerald had already seen the article. Gerald had been awake since 5. "The Crestfield investors are meeting this morning," Gerald said without preamble. "Without you." Dominic set down his coffee cup. "What do you mean without me?" "I mean, they called a meeting among themselves," Gerald said. "I found out from the corporate secretary 20 minutes ago. They're convening at 9 to discuss the implications of the asset structure disclosure. They can't make decisions about a Moretti entity without the operational authority holder," Gerald said. "Dominic, Vivian is the operational authority holder in Crestfield. If they're meeting to discuss the entity's direction in light of the current situation, she has to be invited to that meeting." "She was," Gerald said. Dominic's hand tightened around the phone. "And she's going." Philip Tanaka confirmed her attendance at 8:15 this morning. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car was reversing out of the gate. Security rotation. Who called the meeting? Dominic said. Gerald paused for just a beat too long. Gerald. The request originated from the Crestfield board, Gerald said. But the initial contact, the one who reached out to the board members individually before the formal notice went out. Another pause. It was Ray. Dominic didn't move. Ray Dobbins reached out to the Crestfield investors, Gerald said, separately, individually, before the article ran, which means he had prior knowledge of the timing. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Gerald said, Dominic, are you still there? I'm here, Dominic said. I can file an emergency motion to... Don't file anything, Dominic said. Not yet. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and felt something move through him that was not quite anger, because anger had a heat to it, and what he felt was cold. The specific cold of something fundamental being violated. Ray Dobbins had been with him for 18 years, had been at the table during the worst years, the years when the organization was fighting for its foothold, when there were men who actively wanted Dominic dead, and it was Ray who'd stood between that and the outcome. 18 years. And somewhere in the past week, or longer, Dominic was beginning to understand, possibly much longer, Ray had been making calculations that didn't include Dominic's survival as a necessary variable. He texted Ray back, "My house, 10 o'clock. The reply came in under 30 seconds. "I'll be there." No hesitation, which meant Ray had been expecting the call, which meant Ray had a plan for this conversation. Dominic went upstairs and showered and changed. He stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom for a moment, looking at himself with the detachment of someone trying to read a situation from the outside. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. He looked like a man in the middle of something that was taking more from him than he'd budgeted. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like a man who could lose. He straightened his collar and went downstairs. Ray arrived at 10 exactly, alone, which was itself a statement. In the years Dominic had known him, Ray didn't go places alone. He was a man who understood the optics of presence, who always brought at least one other body in his orbit. Coming alone meant one of two things. Either he was trying to signal good faith, or he had nothing to fear. Dominic met him in the main hall. They didn't shake hands, which was a breach of 18 years of habit that neither of them acknowledged. "Sit down," Dominic said. "I'd rather stand," Ray said. He was wearing a dark jacket, open collar. He looked rested. That was the detail that landed hardest. Ray looked like a man who had slept fine. "The Crestfield meeting," Dominic said. "I reached out to the board members," Ray said. "Yes?" "Before the article." "Before the article." "Which means you knew the article was coming." Ray met his eyes and didn't look away. "I've known things were moving for about 3 weeks," he said, "since before the divorce papers." Dominic absorbed that. 3 weeks. The party had been 2 weeks ago. Ray had known before the party, before the photographs, before any of it. "Who told you?" Dominic said. "Nobody told me," Ray said. "I pay attention. I've been paying attention for a long time." He shifted his weight slightly. "Dominic, I need you to hear what I'm going to say without... Say it." "The organization is not going to survive the next 6 months if it tries to fight her," Ray said. "Legally, structurally, it's not survivable. Gerald knows it. I know it. The Crestfield investors know it now because the article made it impossible to pretend otherwise." He paused. "The question isn't whether she wins the asset dispute. She wins. That's already the outcome. The question is what you have left when the dust settles, and whether you can operate from that. And you decided to answer that question yourself," Dominic said, "by going to the investors behind my back." "I decided to be in a room where decisions were being made," Ray said, "instead of sitting outside it. Those are my investors, Ray." "They're investors in entities where Vivian holds operational authority," Ray said, and the flatness in his voice, the complete absence of apology, was more enraging than any amount of heat would have been. "That's not my opinion. That's what the documents say." The room was quiet. Dominic looked at him. Looked at the man he'd known for 18 years, the man who'd been in more rooms with him than almost anyone alive, and saw something he hadn't seen there before, or hadn't let himself see. The slight forward lean of someone who has decided. The stillness of someone who is not afraid. "You're going with her," Dominic said. Not a question. Ray didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, "I'm going where the structure holds." "Get out of my house," Dominic said. Ray nodded once. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped, turned halfway and said, "For what it's worth, she didn't recruit me. I went to her. I want you to know that." "Why would I want to know that?" Ray seemed to consider it. "Because it means the problem isn't her," he said. "The problem has been building longer than she has." He left. Dominic stood in the center of his own hall and said nothing to no one in a completely empty room. The fireplace was unlit. The chandeliers threw their cold, expensive light on the marble floor. Somewhere a clock ticked. One. The Crestfield meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and by the time it ended, Vivian had been confirmed as the acting operational director of the Crestfield investment entity, pending resolution of the divorce proceedings. Philip Tanaka had prepared the motion. 3 of the 5 board members had voted affirmatively. Ray had sat in the room as a witness. Gerald, who had attended on Dominic's behalf, had filed a formal objection that the board had noted and set aside. Dominic got the summary from Gerald at 1:15 in the afternoon. He was in his car, which he'd been driving without a destination for the better part of an hour, which was something he'd never done in his life. He pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat and listened to Gerald read the summary, and when Gerald finished, there was a silence in which both men understood that a threshold had been crossed that did not uncross. "There's something else," Gerald said. Dominic waited. "I got a call this morning from someone I wasn't expecting," Gerald said. His voice had a texture in it, careful, neutrally paced, the way he talked when the news was the kind he wasn't sure how to land. "A federal attorney. Civil division." Dominic's jaw tightened. "His name is Hartley," Gerald said. "He called my office. He told my assistant it was in regard to financial disclosures connected to the Moretti estate proceedings. He was, professional. He didn't say much. He asked whether you had representation for any federal matters." A pause. "I told him you had general counsel." "What does federal civil want with a divorce filing?" Dominic said. "That's what I asked," Gerald said. "He said, and I'm quoting as closely as I can, he said that the financial documentation entered into the public record in connection with the Moretti divorce proceedings had flagged certain structures for review, structures that may have implications beyond the civil asset dispute." Dominic stared through the windshield at a gas pump, at a woman filling her tank, at the perfectly ordinary surface of an afternoon that was disassembling him. "Say that clearly," Dominic said. "The asset documentation Philip Tanaka filed," Gerald said. "The full inventory. It's in the public record now. And it shows financial structures, some of the holding entities, the layered ownership, that raise questions. Not about Vivian. The federal attorney was very specific about that, about the origin of certain capital flows, about the nature of certain holding structures on the Moretti side." Dominic said nothing. "Dominic," Gerald said, "if they're looking at the financial structures and they're looking at them through documents that went into the public record because of the divorce filing—" "She filed those documents," Dominic said. "Philip Tanaka filed them," Gerald said, "to establish the asset inventory. It's standard in an estate division of this complexity." The slightest pause. He would have known they'd become public record. The gas station. The woman who'd finished filling her tank and was getting back into her car. The ordinary afternoon. "She filed documents that exposed the financial structures," Dominic said slowly, "into the public record, in a civil proceeding." "The civil proceeding that she initiated," Gerald said. Dominic sat with that. Philip Tanaka had prepared an asset inventory so thorough, so precisely documented, that it had accomplished 2 things simultaneously: established Vivian's legal claim to her share of the legitimate holdings, and placed on the public record a financial picture of the Moretti organization detailed enough to attract federal attention. She hadn't filed it to expose him. That wasn't, he was certain, the intent. The intent had been the asset claim. But she was too careful, too meticulous, too many years of precision, Not to have known what a complete financial disclosure of this structure would look like from the outside. Not to have understood that certain capital flows, documented and entered into a federal court record, would draw a specific kind of attention. She had kept herself clean for 11 years. She had been meticulous about it, and the documentation she'd filed to take what was legally hers had, as a consequence, handed the Federal Civil Division a roadmap to everything she'd never touched. "Call Hartley back," Dominic said. "Tell him I'll meet." Dominic, "Before you decide that, I want to—" "Call him back," Dominic said, and ended the call. He sat in the parking lot for another few minutes. A delivery truck pulled in, idled, pulled out again. The traffic on the street moved without purpose. He thought about Ray, sitting in the Crestfield meeting as a witness. He thought about Marcus, who had stood at the door of his dining room and said he was going where the structure held. He thought about city officials calling with new distances in their voices and investors following the documents because the documents had always been the truth. He thought about Carla. He hadn't spoken to her in 3 days. He drove back to the house. Bichette. She was there. Not inside. She didn't have a key. Had never had a key because that had been a line Dominic had maintained without examining why. She was standing at the front gate when he pulled in, which meant she'd been waiting in the cold, which meant she'd been there a while, which told him something about the state she was in before he even got out of the car. She looked different than she'd looked at the party, than she'd looked any time he'd seen her in the past 2 weeks. The self-possession was gone. The careful construction of it, the red dress version of herself that knew exactly what she looked like and deployed it accordingly. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept, and that, somehow, made her look more real than she usually did. "I've been calling," she said, when he got out of the car. "I know," he said. 4 days, Dominic." "Come inside," he said. She came inside. He went to the kitchen because it was neutral ground and because he needed to be somewhere with a counter between him and the next difficult conversation. She sat on one of the bar stools and watched him pour water, and there was a silence that had weight in it, the kind that comes after enough has happened that the preamble seems obscene. "The article," she said. "What about it?" "It named me," she said, "by implication. It said your wife's divorce filing. My name isn't in there, but there are people who—" "I know who you are," he said. "Nobody needed the article to know." "My employer called me yesterday," she said, "the PR firm. My manager asked me to come in for a meeting. She told me that given the visibility of the situation, it might be better if I took a leave of absence." Dominic looked at her. "They let me go," Carla said. The words came out flat, stripped of the self-consciousness she usually wrapped around difficult admissions. "They let me go because having me there was a liability, because my name is connected to yours and your name right now is—" "I know what my name is right now," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen counter. Her eyes were clear in a way he wasn't used to. Not the bright performing clarity of their usual interactions, but something rawer. The look of a person who has had the architecture of a plan fall on them. "What are we doing?" she said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what are we doing? You and me. What is this now?" She pressed her fingers flat on the counter. "Because when this started, it was, you told me that things were, you said, by summer—" "Don't," he said. "You told me, I know what I told you." The kitchen was bright and still, and the afternoon light was coming through the windows over the sink in the way it always did at this hour, and the ordinariness of it was somehow the worst part. "You were never going to leave her," Carla said. Not accusing, just arriving at it, in real time, the way you arrive at something you've known for a long time and refused to land on. Dominic said nothing. "Were you?" she said. He looked at her. At the woman who had brought a box of photographs downstairs at a party because she'd wanted to demonstrate something, who had stood beside him at a fireplace and watched him burn 40 years of someone's family history, and who was now sitting in the house that had never been going to be hers, in the wreckage of a plan that had never been what she'd believed it was. "No," he said. The word fell into the room like something solid. Carla's expression did something complicated, compressed, then went very still. She looked down at the counter. 1 breath. 2. When she looked up, her eyes were dry, which told him more than crying would have. "I need to know something," she said. Her voice had changed. the softness gone, something harder and more careful underneath it. The night of the party. Did you know, before you threw the photographs in the fire, did you know what she had? The legal position? Dominic looked at her. Did you know that burning those photographs was going to set this off? She said. Or were you as blind as I was? The question hung in the cold kitchen air, and Dominic Moretti, who had not told the truth reflexively in longer than he could clearly remember, said, I didn't know. Carla nodded slowly. Something in her face settled. Not comfort. The opposite of comfort. The settling of a person who has confirmed a thing they needed confirmed. Then we were both idiots, she said. She picked up her bag from the counter. She stood. Carla, see, he said. She stopped but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said. He said it the way a man says something he means but has almost no practice in saying. It came out rough and too quiet, and he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for specifically. For the false promise of Summer, for using her as a prop at his own party, for the photographs, for everything that photograph burning had started and that she was now standing in the wreckage of with him. She turned halfway. Her profile was sharp in the afternoon light. Keep it, she said. I don't need it. She walked out. The door closed. Dominic stood in his kitchen alone and the house breathed around him, enormous and expensive and completely empty of anything that meant something. And outside, the city was doing whatever the city did, indifferent, constant, and somewhere across town Vivian Hale was in an apartment he hadn't known about, building something he hadn't seen coming. And in a federal building downtown, a man named Hartley was looking at financial documents that had been placed in the public record by the most careful person Dominic Moretti had ever shared a table with. He picked up his phone. He called Gerald. Set the meeting with Hartley, he said. Tomorrow morning. I'll make the call, Gerald said. Then, carefully, Dominic, before you go into that meeting, I need you to understand what you may be walking into. If they've been looking at the structures and they have documentation, the meeting may not be an inquiry. It may be the beginning of something more formal. I know what it may be, Dominic said, and you want to proceed. Dominic looked around the kitchen, at the counter where Carla had sat, at the window where Vivian had stood on the morning she handed him the envelope, at the coffee maker she'd bought 3 years ago because he'd complained about the old one and she'd simply replaced it without making anything of it. I don't have another option, he said. You could decline the meeting, Gerald said, at least until we understand what— Gerald, Dominic said, how many people have walked away from me in the past 10 days? Silence. Set the meeting, Dominic said. He set the phone down. He walked to the window over the sink and looked out at the back lawn, where the light was beginning to go flat the way it did in the late afternoon. The hedges needed trimming. He'd never noticed that before, or had noticed and assumed it would be handled, the way he'd assumed everything was handled, by the invisible architecture of competence that had surrounded him for 11 years, and that he had systematically failed to see. Everything he had built was built on something he had not looked at, and now he was going to walk into a federal attorney's office and try to salvage what was left with nothing in his hands and no one at his back, and the full cold knowledge that the woman who could have helped him navigate this, the only person who had ever actually understood the shape of the thing he'd built, was across the city in an apartment he hadn't known about, sleeping fine. He had one move left. He didn't know yet if it was survivable, but there was no longer any ground behind him, and what was in front of him was a meeting with a federal attorney and the beginning of the longest, most consequential conversation of his life. A conversation he was going to have to walk into as something he had never, in 51 years of living, had any occasion to be. Honest. The federal building was downtown, 12 floors of glass and concrete that looked like every other federal building in every other city, designed to communicate permanence without warmth, authority without personality. Dominic had driven past it hundreds of times over the years and had never had reason to go inside. That was the point of the legitimate architecture, the reason he'd spent so much energy and money building it, so that buildings like this one remained, for him, hypothetical. He went through security at 8:52 in the morning. Gerald was beside him, briefcase, dark suit, the careful expression of a man who had spent the drive downtown reminding Dominic of things he was not to say. Dominic had listened without responding, which Gerald had correctly interpreted as Dominic having already decided how this meeting was going to go, regardless of counsel. The elevator was slow. Dominic watched the floor numbers change and felt his own heartbeat in a way he normally didn't. Not fast, just present, audible to himself. The specific physical awareness of a body that knows it's walking into something. Hartley's office was on the 9th floor. His assistant met them at the elevator and walked them down a corridor that smelled like paper and recycled air and the particular institutional dryness of government buildings. She opened a door into a conference room, not an office, neutral ground, which told Dominic something about how Hartley wanted this framed. Hartley was already seated. He was younger than Dominic had expected. Mid-40s, compact, with the unremarkable face of someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had decided long ago to use that. He stood when they came in and shook hands with the brief professional grip of a man who didn't put anything extra into handshakes. "Mr. Moretti," he said. "Gerald." A nod to Gerald, which meant they'd spoken before, which meant Gerald had given him something already without telling Dominic. Dominic noted that and filed it. They sat. Hartley's side of the table had one other person, a woman, younger, who opened a laptop and positioned it without introduction. A recorder, or a note-taker. Both, probably. "I appreciate you coming in," Hartley said. "You made it easy to say yes," Dominic said. Something moved at the corner of Hartley's mouth. Not quite a smile. "The documentation entered into the public record in connection with your divorce proceeding," Hartley said, setting a folder on the table without opening it. "It's thorough. More thorough than we typically see in civil estate filings." "My wife's attorney is good at his job," Dominic said. "Philip Tanaka," Hartley said. "Yes, he is." A pause. "The documentation details the holding structures for the Moretti legitimate portfolio going back approximately 9 years. Capital flows, entity arrangements, investment timelines." He pressed the folder flat with 2 fingers. "Some of those structures raised questions for our office." "What kind of questions?" Gerald said. Hartley looked at Gerald briefly, then back at Dominic, talking to the principal. "The kind that relate to the origin of capital used to fund certain entities, specifically 3 holding companies established between 2015 and 2018, the parcel entities." Dominic kept his face neutral. The parcel entities were 3-layered holding structures, real, legitimate on their face, but funded in their initial capitalization from sources that were not, at their origin, clean. It had been done carefully. He had believed it had been done carefully enough. "What about them?" Dominic said. "The documentation Tanaka filed traces the development capital for those entities," Hartley said. "It's in the filing because those entities connect to the Crestfield Partnership and the Kenmore development, which are part of the asset dispute." He opened the folder now. 1 page, a diagram, a flowchart of entity relationships. Dominic recognized his own financial architecture rendered in federal pen. "The connection is clear. We can follow the capital from its origin point through the parcel entities and into those developments." Gerald put his hand on the table, a gesture Dominic recognized as his attorney's version of intervening. "My client is here as a courtesy," Gerald said. "Before we go further—" "Gerald," Dominic said. Gerald stopped. "Let him finish," Dominic said. Hartley looked at Dominic with the expression of a man who had just had something confirmed. He nodded slightly. "We're not here to litigate the origin of that capital today," he said. "We're here because there's an opportunity, and I'm using that word deliberately, for this to be resolved in a way that doesn't require a grand jury." The room was very still. "What you're describing is cooperation," Gerald said carefully. "I'm describing a conversation," Hartley said, "about what Mr. Moretti knows, what he's willing to document, and what that documentation might be worth in the context of a broader inquiry that has been ongoing for longer than this divorce filing." Dominic looked at the flowchart on the table, his own structure, rendered by someone else's hand. Everything he'd built, every careful layer of it, reduced to a diagram on 1 page in a conference room with recycled air and a woman taking notes on a laptop. "Broader than me," Dominic said. "Significantly broader," Hartley said. "Who?" Dominic said. Hartley closed the folder. That's the conversation, he said. They were in that room for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Dominic did not commit to anything during those 3 hours and 40 minutes. He listened. He asked questions that Gerald kept trying to intercept and that he kept asking anyway. He learned the shape of what Hartley actually had, which was substantial but not yet complete, and the shape of what Hartley wanted, which was testimony and documentation relating to 3 men whose names Dominic had not spoken aloud to any federal employee in his life. When they left the building, Gerald walked beside him to the car without speaking. The morning had turned cold, a gray front moving in from the west, the sky the color of old concrete. Their breath came in small visible clouds. At the car, Gerald said, "You cannot make this decision in a week." "I'm not making it in a week," Dominic said. "What Hartley is asking for, I know what he's asking for." "The 3 men he named," Gerald said. His voice had dropped, which was unnecessary in an empty parking structure but was instinctive. "If you cooperate, if you give them documentation on those 3, you understand what that means. For your safety, for the organization, for what's left of the organization," Dominic said. Gerald pressed his lips together. "The organization is already gone, Gerald," Dominic said. It came out flat and final and true. "Ray is at Crestfield. Marcus is wherever the structure holds. The political contacts are recalibrating. The investors are following the documents." He opened the car door. "What I'm deciding now is what I personally survive. And if I cooperate, I have something to trade," Dominic said. "If I don't, I have nothing. And in 6 months I have an indictment." Gerald looked at him across the roof of the car. "This isn't a decision you can walk back," he said. "Nothing I've done in the past 2 weeks is something I can walk back," Dominic said. "Get in the car." He drove home and found Ray Dobbins' car in the driveway. Not Ray, 2 men he didn't recognize sitting in Ray's car, engine running. They didn't get out when Dominic pulled in. They watched him. He watched them back. He went inside without acknowledging them, and the door of his own house closed behind him, and he stood in the hallway and thought, "This is what it looks like now." He went to the kitchen, made coffee. His hands were steady, which surprised him. He'd expected something different in his hands after 3 hours in a federal building. A tremor, a looseness. Instead, they were steady and tired, the way hands get when the thing they've been braced for has finally arrived and can be set down. His phone rang. Unknown number, which he almost didn't answer. He answered. Dominic Moretti. A man's voice he didn't know, low, even, with a quality he recognized from long experience. The tone of someone who operated in the same world he did, but from a different position in it. "Who is this?" Dominic said. "A friend of some people who are concerned," the voice said. "About your meeting this morning." Dominic's jaw tightened. 9 hours since the meeting. 12 floors in a federal building with security at the door, and this call was already in his kitchen. "Word travels," he said, keeping his own voice level. "It always does," the voice said. "The people I represent want you to understand that whatever conversation you had this morning, they hope it was unproductive, and that it stays that way. And if it doesn't," Dominic said, a pause, "then the situation becomes more complicated for you than a divorce filing." Dominic looked at the window over the sink, at the lawn, at the hedges that still needed trimming. "Tell them I heard them," he said. The line went dead. He set the phone on the counter and stood with his hands flat on the surface, feeling the cool of the stone under his palms, and breathed. One breath, then another. His chest was tight in a way it hadn't been in the federal building, which was the specific tightness of understanding that the walls were closer than they'd been this morning and getting closer. He picked the phone back up and called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. A woman answered. Vivian Hale's office. He hadn't known she had an office. He filed that without reaction. "Tell her Dominic is calling," he said. "She'll take it, or she won't." 30 seconds of hold music, which struck him as almost surreal. Hold music, as if this were a dentist's appointment. Then, "Dominic." Her voice was the same. He didn't know what he'd expected, that it would be different, that the past 2 weeks would have changed the timbre of it. It was exactly the same, measured, unrushed, slightly lower than you expected when you first met her. "I need to see you," he said. A pause. "No," she said. "Vivian, I'm not going to meet with you," she said. "Whatever you need to say it to Philip." "This isn't about the asset dispute," he said. A shorter pause this time. "What is it about?" she said. He looked at the door of the kitchen, at the hallway beyond it, at the house that had been, for 11 years, the container of everything. The good years and the wasted years and the years that were simply inertia. "I went to see Hartley this morning," he said. The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a texture. He could hear her breathing, not unsteady, just present, the way his own heartbeat had been present in the elevator. "I know," she said. Of course she knew. "I need you to understand what I'm considering," he said, "and what it means, for both of us. Because some of the documentation they're working from, it came from Philip's filing. And when this moves forward, if it moves forward, my documentation was clean," she said. "Philip made sure of that." "I know it was clean," he said. "I'm not suggesting—" "Then what are you suggesting?" He pressed his free hand flat against the counter again. Steadying thing. "I'm suggesting that what happens next is going to be loud," he said, "and public. And that some of what gets loud and public is going to attach to your name, whether you want it to or not. Because you were my wife for 11 years, and that's not going to be invisible." Another silence. "Is this a warning?" she said. "Or are you asking me for something?" The directness of it. 11 years, and she was still the most direct person he'd ever spoken to. The one who would not let a sentence do two things when he wanted it to, and would force him to say the one thing it actually meant. "I don't know," he said. "Both, maybe." "I don't need your warning," she said. "Philip has been managing my exposure since before I filed. I'm protected." A beat. "Are you?" He laughed. The short sound again, the one that wasn't humor. "No," he said. "Then that's your problem to solve," she said. "Not mine." "I know," he said. The line was quiet for a moment. He could hear something in the background of her end. The sound of an office, paper, the low ambient noise of a space that was functional and organized and hers. "Dominic," she said. "Yeah." "Whatever you decide to do in that meeting—" She stopped, started again, more carefully. "Make sure you're doing it because it's the right decision for your survival, not because you think it changes anything between us, because it doesn't." "I know that too," he said. "Good," she said. And then, with the exact same tone, "I hope you find a way through it." She hung up. He stood in the kitchen with the dead phone in his hand and felt the specific, particular weight of those words. "I hope you find a way through it," which were neither warm nor cold, neither forgiveness nor its opposite, but simply the plain, unadorned truth of a person who had decided to be done with something and yet retained, somewhere beneath the doneness, the basic human capacity to wish the other person something other than total destruction. He set the phone down. Outside, Ray's car was still in the driveway. The two men were still there. He could see them from the kitchen window if he leaned slightly, the roof of the car, the engine still running. A message being delivered by presence. "We know where you went. We know what you're thinking. We are in your driveway." 23 years ago, he would have walked out there and resolved this at close range without a second thought. He'd been a different kind of man then. Not better, not worse, but simpler in his methods, more direct. The years of building the legitimate side had changed something in him, had required a different set of muscles, and those muscles were what he had now when the simpler method was no longer the available one. He went upstairs. In the bedroom, in the closet, in the back behind the suits he'd stopped wearing 2 years ago, was a safe. He opened it. Inside were the things he kept there. Documents, some cash, 2 phones that weren't connected to any of his registered accounts. And something else, a small external hard drive, gray plastic, unremarkable, the kind that could sit in a drawer for years without anyone noticing. He took it out and held it. 4 years ago, in a period of careful and private paranoia that he'd never discussed with anyone, he had spent 3 months documenting. Not everything. Not the things that would destroy him along with everyone else, but specific transactions, specific arrangements, specific meetings, and their outcomes, involving the three men Hartley had named this morning. He'd done it not as leverage, exactly, more as insurance. The habit of a man who'd learned early that having something nobody knew you had was the only reliable form of security. He hadn't told Gerald about it, hadn't told Marcus, hadn't told Ray, had told no one. He turned the drive over in his hands. It was lighter than what it contained. Everything significant usually was. His phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number he didn't recognize, different from the one that had called earlier. 3 words. Don't do it. He read the text twice, set the phone on the bed, set the hard drive beside it. He sat on the edge of the bed, in the house that was half gone, and looked at the 2 objects, the phone and the drive, and understood that he was sitting at the exact center of the thing, the point where all the lines of the past 3 weeks converged. The divorce, the asset structure, Ray's defection, the federal meeting, the voice on the phone, Vivian's steady breathing on a call she'd almost declined. He was 51 years old. He had built something that had lasted 23 years and that had, in the space of 2 weeks, revealed itself to be built on a foundation he hadn't designed and couldn't defend. The woman who had actually designed it was across the city, protected, clean, building something new under her own name. The men who'd stood beside him had followed the structure to wherever the structure now pointed. The man who'd been his attorney for 16 years was currently, he suspected, composing a text to his own malpractice insurer. And somewhere in a gray federal building, a man named Hartley was waiting to see whether Dominic Moretti was going to be a problem or a solution. He picked up the hard drive, turned it once more in his fingers. Downstairs, the front door opened. He heard it. The specific sound of his front door, the click of the handle, and the slight resistance of the frame. Sounds he'd heard 10,000 times and that now carried a different weight. He hadn't given anyone a key. The security code had been changed 3 days ago. He'd done it himself, one of the few things he'd handled personally in the past week, because he hadn't trusted anyone else with even that. He heard footsteps. Not hurried, even deliberate, someone who knew the layout of the house. He stood up from the bed, hard drive still in his hand. The footsteps came up the stairs. He stood facing the bedroom door and felt his heart beat again, the way he'd felt it in the elevator, present and audible, and the sound of a body that knows what it's about to face before the mind finishes catching up. The door opened. Ray Dobbins stood in the frame, not the 2 men from the car. Ray himself, in the dark jacket, the open collar, the rested face that had somehow slept through the last 2 weeks while Dominic had not. He looked at Dominic, at the hard drive in Dominic's hand. Something moved across Ray's face that was almost like regret but landed closer to resignation. "I was hoping," Ray said, "that you hadn't kept copies." Dominic said nothing. His grip on the drive tightened. "How long?" Dominic said. Ray looked at him. "How long have you been working against me?" Dominic said. Ray came into the room slowly, the way you approach something that might still move fast if startled. "I haven't been working against you," he said. "I've been working towards something that doesn't include you. That's different." "Not from where I'm standing," Dominic said. "No," Ray said. "I don't suppose it is." The 2 men stood in the bedroom of a house that was half in legal dispute, looking at each other across 18 years and a small gray hard drive. And the light outside was going flat and gray with the front that had been moving in all day. And the room was very quiet, and Dominic understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the worst moments, that the next 60 seconds were going to determine whether he walked out of this house on his own terms or not at all. "What's on the drive?" Ray said. "Everything Hartley needs," Dominic said. Ray looked at him steadily. "You'd put yourself in it too," he said. "You know that." "I know that." "Then you're not doing this to protect yourself," Ray said. "You're doing it because there's nothing left to protect." The words landed true, and Dominic felt them land and did not look away. "Give me the drive," Ray said. His voice was calm, not threatening, or not only threatening. There was something underneath it that might have been a last offer, Might have been the last version of the 18 years that was still available. Dominic looked at him, at the man who'd stood beside him through the worst years, at the man who had been calculating, for longer than Dominic had known, the moment when standing beside him was no longer the viable position. He thought about Vivian's voice on the phone. "I hope you find a way through it." He thought about a box of photographs becoming ash. He thought about what it cost, over a lifetime, to be the man who never looked at the foundation. His hand tightened on the drive. And in that suspended moment, before anything moved or broke or resolved, he made the decision that would define everything that came after. Not loudly, not with any of the drama he'd brought to every significant moment of the past 23 years, but quietly, the way the most consequential things are always decided, in the silence between one breath and the next, with nothing in his hand but the weight of what he'd built and the cold, clear knowledge of what it had actually cost. He didn't give Ray the drive. What he did was something Ray hadn't anticipated, which was the first advantage Dominic had held in 2 weeks. He moved. Not toward Ray, not away. Sideways, the 2 steps that put the bed between them and the door behind him. The instinctive geometry of a man who had spent his 20s in rooms where the distance to the exit was always the first thing you calculated. Ray read it immediately. His weight shifted. "Don't," he said. "You came into my house," Dominic said. His voice came out low and even, and the evenness surprised him. "Through a door you shouldn't have a code for, which means someone on my security gave it to you, which means this has been going on longer than Crestfield." Ray's jaw tightened. The regret in his face from a moment ago had been replaced by something colder and more operational. "Give me the drive, Dominic." The 2 men downstairs," Dominic said. "Are they here to make sure this goes clean, or to make sure I don't leave the house?" Ray said nothing, which was an answer. Dominic looked at him across the bed, across 18 years, across everything they'd built and navigated and survived together, and saw the thing he hadn't let himself see clearly in the dining room meeting, which was that Ray's defection wasn't recent and wasn't reactive. It was structural, planned. The way Vivian's legal position had been planned, not in response to a specific event, but built over time, quietly, with the patience of someone who had decided the current arrangement was temporary and had been preparing for its end longer than anyone knew. The difference was that Vivian had been protecting herself. Ray had been positioning to take something. "Who are you working with?" Dominic said. "That doesn't matter right now." "It matters to me." Ray took a step around the foot of the bed, slow, deliberate. "What matters right now is that drive," he said. "Because if you walk out of this house and give that to Hartley, it doesn't just end you. It ends people who have very specific ideas about what happens to men who talk to federal attorneys." "I know who it ends," Dominic said. I built those arrangements." "Then you know what they're capable of." "I know exactly what they're capable of," Dominic said. "I've known for 23 years, and I've spent 23 years being careful enough that they never had reason to point it at me." He looked at Ray steadily. "You took that away when you went to the Crestfield board, when this became public record, when you made it so that the only move I had left was the one I'm making." Something moved across Ray's face. Not quite guilt. He was too far past guilt for it to arrive cleanly. But a shadow of something. The recognition of a specific causality he hadn't fully calculated. "You pushed me here," Dominic said. "You pushed yourself here," Ray said. "The night of the party, the photographs. That was you." "The photographs were the start," Dominic said. "What came after? That was someone who saw the opening and moved into it before the dust settled." Ray stopped moving. They stood on opposite sides of the bed in the gray afternoon light and looked at each other, and the room was so quiet that Dominic could hear the engine of the car outside, still running, still waiting. "Last chance," Ray said. Dominic looked at him. He thought about the elevator, about his heartbeat in that gray federal building, present and audible, about Vivian's voice. "I hope you find a way through it." "No," he said. Ray's hand moved toward his jacket, and Dominic threw the drive. Not at Ray, past him, toward the door, hard, the small gray rectangle spinning through the air and hitting the hallway wall beyond the doorframe with a sharp crack. Ray's eyes tracked it instinctively, the half-second of reflex that every human being has when an object moves fast near them, and in that half-second, Dominic crossed the distance between them. He was 51 years old and hadn't moved like this in years, and he felt every one of those years in his shoulder when he hit Ray. Not cleanly, not the way it would have gone at 30, but with enough force and enough desperation that Ray went into the doorframe sideways and lost the gun he'd been reaching for, which skittered into the hallway. They were in the doorway then, both of them, Ray trying to recover his footing and Dominic holding his wrist with both hands. And Ray was stronger than he looked, always had been, one of the things about him Dominic had always respected. And what followed was not a fight in any clean sense of the word. It was two men in their 50s in a doorway, breathing hard, one of them trying to reach a gun on the floor and the other trying to prevent it, and neither of them moving with any grace whatsoever. Dominic got to the gun first. By luck more than skill, Ray's foot slipped on the hardwood and the momentary loss of balance was enough. Dominic got his hand on the gun and got himself upright and put 3 feet of distance between them and turned around. Ray straightened. He was breathing hard. A cut on his forehead from the doorframe, not deep, bleeding slightly. He pressed the back of his hand against it and looked at Dominic. "Now what?" Ray said between breaths. Dominic was breathing harder than he wanted to be. His shoulder was going to be significant tomorrow. He looked at the man in front of him, at the blood on his forehead, at 18 years looking back at him with the particular expression of someone who had made their calculation and was now absorbing the outcome. "Call off the men downstairs," Dominic said. "Right now." Ray looked at him for a moment, then he took out his phone and made a short call. 4 words, nothing more, and ended it. 30 seconds later, Dominic heard the car outside put itself in gear and pull away. "Where's the drive?" Ray said. "In the hallway somewhere," Dominic said. "I'm going to find it, and I'm going to walk out of here, and you're not going to follow me." He looked at Ray steadily. "Because if you do, I have enough in my head, names, dates, arrangements, that the drive is almost a courtesy. You follow me? I sit in Hartley's office, and I talk from memory for 6 hours. And some of what I remember includes you." Ray looked at him. "We're done," Dominic said. "Whatever we were for 18 years, we're done. Walk away from this." Ray pressed the back of his hand against his forehead again, looked at the blood, made a sound that carried everything he wasn't going to say. The full weight of 18 years and a decision made too soon or too late or simply wrong, the sound men make when the accounting doesn't come out the way they'd projected. He turned and walked down the stairs. Dominic stood in the hallway and listened to the front door close and then stood in the silence for a full 30 seconds, breathing, feeling his shoulder, letting his heartbeat come back down from wherever it had gone. Then he found the drive on the hallway floor, the casing cracked but intact, and he put it in his jacket pocket and went downstairs and out to his car. He drove to Gerald's office. He walked in without an appointment, which Gerald's assistant tried to intercept and then didn't because something in Dominic's face foreclosed the conversation. He sat down across from Gerald and put the drive on the desk between them. Gerald looked at it, looked at Dominic's shoulder, which was visibly wrong, looked at his face. "Call Hartley," Dominic said. "Tell him I'm ready to sit down for real." Gerald looked at the drive for another moment. Then he picked up the phone. Yet, the cooperation agreement took 11 days to negotiate. Dominic did not go home during those 11 days. He stayed in a hotel downtown. Not a good one, which would have been traceable, but a mid-range business hotel with a breakfast bar and a view of a parking structure, chosen by Gerald for its anonymity. He ate room service and reviewed documents and spoke to Gerald 3 times a day, and did not speak to anyone else he'd known before the party. On the 4th day, his phone showed a call from a number he recognized as belonging to one of the 3 men Hartley had named. He did not answer. He noted the time and number and relayed it to Gerald, who relayed it to Hartley's office, where it became part of the documentation. On the 7th day, Gerald told him that Ray Dobbins had retained an attorney. Dominic said nothing in response to this. On the 9th day, Gerald told him that the Kenmore development had formally transferred operational management to Vivian Hale, ratified by the full board, and that the Crestfield entity had done the same. The legitimate portfolio, what was left of it after the divorce split, was now formally, finally, and irrevocably hers. "The commercial asset's on my side," Dominic said. "What's the number?" Gerald told him the number. It was not nothing. It was also not what it had been. It was the residue of 23 years, the portion of the structure that had been clearly, unambiguously his by origin and operation, stripped of everything that had required Vivian to function. In a world where he was also now cooperating with a federal attorney on matters that would, within the year, become public, it was the number that defined what came after. He sat with it. The number and its implications and the specific texture of what it meant to have less than you believed you had for a very long time. "It's enough," he said finally. Gerald looked at him. "It's enough for what?" "To start something smaller," Dominic said. "Something I can actually run." Gerald said nothing for a moment. Then, "The cooperation agreement is going to require a period of reduced profile. You understand that?" "I understand." "The men you're giving testimony on, they have reach. You'll need to be careful." "I've been careful before," Dominic said. "I know how it works." "This is different from anything you've done before," Gerald said quietly, not unkindly. "Yeah," Dominic said. "I know that too." He signed the cooperation agreement on the 11th day. It was a thick document, dense with conditions and stipulations and careful language about the scope of what he was agreeing to and what protections he would receive in exchange. He read every page, which Gerald hadn't expected, and asked specific questions about 2 clauses, which Gerald answered. Then he signed it. It was the most honest thing he'd put his name to in 23 years. That thought arrived without irony and stayed with him on the drive back to the hotel. The weight of it neither satisfying nor devastating, simply true, the way the most significant things tend to be. But the indictments came 6 months later. Dominic was not in the city when they were announced. He was in a mid-sized town 4 hours north, in a house he'd rented under a name Gerald had helped him establish, modest and wooden and situated at the end of a gravel road with a view of a lake that was unremarkable and private and, in the mornings, genuinely quiet in a way the estate had never been. He read about the indictments on his laptop at the kitchen table with coffee he'd made himself, which was still not very good, a fact he'd decided to accept. 3 names. The 3 Hartley had named. The charges were extensive and specific, and the documentation cited in the filing was, in several places, material he recognized from his own testimony. He read through the full press release twice and then closed the laptop and took his coffee to the porch and sat looking at the lake. He thought about Ray. Ray had not been indicted, which meant Ray had also made a deal. He'd known that was likely. Ray was too careful to be caught with nothing to trade. Whatever Ray had given Hartley's office, it had been enough. Dominic didn't know the specifics and didn't try to find out. What he felt about it was not quite forgiveness and not quite indifference, something between the complicated residue of 18 years and a door frame and a gun on a hardwood floor. He thought about the organization. What was left of it was not his. The legitimate remnants were Vivian's, being managed with the quiet efficiency he recognized, and that no longer had anything to do with him. The other parts, the underground machinery, had dispersed the way these things always dispersed when the center couldn't hold, outward, fragmenting, reconfiguring under other names and other arrangements. He'd heard things, peripherally. He hadn't looked closely. That life was done. He sat on the porch for a long time that morning. At noon, his phone rang. Gerald, with a procedural update about the cooperation timeline. They spoke for 20 minutes. Dominic asked 2 questions and received 2 answers, and thanked Gerald and hung up. Then he sat quietly some more. He was learning in this house by this lake that he did not know how to be quiet. It was a skill he had never developed because he had never needed it, had always filled silence with motion or strategy or the noise of the organization. The quiet here was constant and patient, and it did not care whether he was comfortable with it. He was getting better at it, slowly. Some days he drove into town, bought groceries, sat in a diner and read the local paper and ate eggs that were ordinary and fine. Nobody knew him here. Nobody looked at him with calculation or deference or the careful blankness of someone managing their response to a powerful man. He was simply a man at a table eating eggs, and the anonymity of it, which he had always believed he would find intolerable, turned out to be something else. He was working on understanding what that something else was. He didn't reach out to Vivian. He'd thought about it in the early months, had composed versions of what he might say, not pleading, not justifying. Something more stripped down than that. An acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement that had been due for years and that he had avoided with every instrument available to him and that she had, in the end, stopped waiting for. He didn't send it. Not because it wasn't true, but because he understood, with a clarity that the quiet had given him, that what she needed from him was nothing, that the most honest thing he could give her was the absence of any further demand on her attention. She had spent 11 years managing the consequences of his choices. Requiring her to receive his acknowledgement was simply another version of the same thing. So he didn't. What he did, 8 months after he left the city, was write it down. In a notebook, longhand, the kind of writing he hadn't done since he was a young man. He wrote about the photographs, about the specific moment he'd picked up the box and made the choice that had made all the other choices available, about what he'd understood in the moment and what he hadn't understood and the gap between those two things, which was not small. He wrote for 3 hours, and when he was done, he read it once and then closed the notebook and put it in a drawer. It wasn't for her, it was for himself. For the record he was now keeping, in the privacy of a house by a lake, of what things had actually cost and what they had actually been. He slept better after that. Not well. He suspected he was done sleeping well, that this was now simply the quality of his nights, which was a form of accounting he could accept, but better. Sent. Vivian Hale opened the doors of Hale Development Group on a bright morning in October, 11 months after the divorce was finalized. The office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, not the same building as Philip Tanaka's office, a different one, her own. The space was clean and uncluttered, the furniture chosen for function rather than statement. The view a modest one of the city's mid-range skyline rather than anything dramatic. She had done the interior herself, or close to it, had made the decisions, at least, rather than delegating them to someone whose taste she was trying to accommodate. On the reception desk was a small framed photograph. It was not original. Nothing in it was original, because the originals were ash in a fireplace that was probably being used for atmosphere again in a house she no longer thought about very often. But Philip had engaged a photograph restorer 8 months ago, a specialist who worked with family archives, and had handed her a thumb drive with the results. Digital reconstructions of 23 of the photographs, sourced from combination of the ones Vivian could describe in detail, a handful of old slides her mother's sister had kept, and a single physical copy of the shore photograph that had survived in a cousin's album in another state. The reconstructions were not the same as the originals. She knew that. The grain was different. The color calibration was approximate. The specific quality of the old photography paper could not be replicated in a digital print. But her mother's face was there, close enough. Her father's hair, the shore, the light on her mother's shoulders. She had framed the shore photograph and put it on her desk. She sat behind the desk on the morning of the opening and looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. The way you look at something you know is an approximation of the thing you lost, and that is nevertheless real in its own right, carrying its own weight, meaning something new alongside the grief of the original. Then she opened her laptop and began. Philip came by at noon. He knocked on the open door of her office and she waved him in, and he sat across from her desk with the ease of a man who had been in her orbit for 7 years and who had found through all of the past year's events that his instinct to trust her judgment had been, across every single decision, correct. Crestfield Quarterly Numbers, he said, setting a folder on her desk. She opened it, read the first page. Better than projected, she said. By 11%, Philip said. She nodded, continued reading. The Kenmore development timeline? On track for the Phase 2 opening in spring, he said. The city planning contact confirmed the permit clearance yesterday. She turned a page. Marcus? He's settled well into the operations role, Philip said. He's been... I think the word is relieved. He said that to me, actually, that he's relieved. She looked up briefly. I know the feeling, she said, and went back to reading. Philip watched her for a moment. He had worked with a great many difficult and capable people over 30 years of practice, and he had developed, through that experience, a fairly accurate instrument for distinguishing between competence and its more common substitutes. Vivian Hale was the most genuinely capable person he'd worked with in his career. And the thing about her that made her that, he'd decided, was not intelligence. He'd worked with people as intelligent, but this. She was the same in every room, the same measured pace, the same unshowy precision, the same complete absence of performance. She didn't need the room to know she was capable. She just was. "How are you?" he said when she'd finished the first document and moved to the second. She looked up, considered the question with the slight pause she gave things she was taking seriously. "Busy," she said, "which is what I wanted. And otherwise." Another pause, shorter. "I'm all right," she said. "It's a different kind of quiet than I expected." "Good quiet or bad quiet?" She thought about it. "Just quiet," she said. "I'm getting used to it." Philip nodded. He understood that this was the complete answer, that she wasn't withholding. She was simply being accurate about a condition that was still being defined. He respected that. "One more thing," he said. "I got a call from Gerald Foss this morning." She continued reading, but her posture shifted slightly, the infinitesimal adjustment of someone tracking a new variable. "He wanted me to know," Philip said carefully, "that Dominic has been compliant with the cooperation terms. No complications, and that he's—" Gerald used the phrase genuinely reduced, not performing it. Vivian turned a page. "Gerald said he'd never seen him like this," Philip said. "Said there were moments in the cooperation sessions where he said things that Gerald didn't recognize him in." She finished the page, set the document down, looked at the photograph on her desk for a moment. The shore, her parents, the recovered light. "Good," she said. "Just the word." "That's all?" Philip said. She looked at him. "What else would there be?" He considered it. "Some people might feel, I don't know, satisfaction or the opposite." "I feel neither," she said, and then more slowly. "What I feel is that it's done, and that done is what I needed it to be." She looked back at the folder. "Let's go through the Kenmore timeline in detail. I want to understand the permit language before spring." Philip opened his own folder. They worked through lunch, the office filled slowly around them. 3 staff members she'd hired, a project coordinator she'd brought from the Crestfield team who had called her directly, 3 weeks after the divorce filing, to ask if there was going to be something to join. There was the sound of a functioning organization taking its first full breath, the particular noise of things beginning rather than continuing, which was quieter than you'd expect and steadier. At 3 in the afternoon, she stepped out of a call and stood at the window of her office and looked at the city below. October light on the buildings, the streets moving with the ordinary momentum of a Thursday afternoon, people and cars and the unremarkable machinery of daily life. She thought about the photographs. She thought about them the way she always would. She'd accepted that, not with the specific grief of the first weeks, but with the quieter, settled acknowledgement of loss that becomes, over time, simply part of the architecture of a person. The photographs were gone. The morning she'd pressed her palm to the top of the box, not knowing it was one of the last times. The specific weight of that loss was hers to carry, and she carried it, and it had not stopped her from doing anything she needed to do, and it never would. What Dominic had burned was real, and it was gone. What he had not been able to burn was also real, and it was in the framed print on her desk and in the folder Philip had just left on her conference table, and in the name on the door of this office, and in the quiet steadiness of a woman standing at a window in October, looking at a city that was simply going on, the way things go on, without asking anyone's permission. She went back to her desk. She opened the next folder. Outside the window, the afternoon continued, the light moving across the buildings the way light moves in October. Lower than summer, more angled, catching things differently, throwing longer shadows, but also, in compensation, a warmth when it hit you directly that you didn't get in other months. The kind of light that made things look exactly like what they were, neither better nor worse, simply accurate. In a house by a lake 4 hours north, a man sat on a porch with bad coffee and a notebook and the specific hard-won quiet of someone learning to live inside the consequences of choices he'd made and couldn't revise. He was not at peace. He was something more modest than that, present in a way he hadn't been in a very long time, to the actual texture of an actual day, without the noise of power and performance filling every available space. It was not comfortable. It was real. He was beginning to understand that these two things were not always the same, and that real was the one that lasted. Neither of them spoke to each other again. There was nothing more to say that the year hadn't already said more plainly than either of them could have managed. The divorce had been about photographs, if you wanted to reduce it to its first visible moment. But photographs were never what it had really been about. And everyone who'd been in that room on a Saturday night in front of a fireplace had understood that, even in the moment, even without words. It had been about the thing underneath the photographs. The assumption that what a person holds most carefully can be taken from them without consequence, that the quiet ones can be dismissed, that what works in the dark doesn't count, that love and dignity and the long, unremarked labor of building something real are things you can burn and replace and burn again. He had burned them, and she had simply, without theater, without a single wasted motion, shown him what they were actually worth. That was the whole of it. Everything else, the attorneys and the asset structures and the federal building and the hard drive and the men in the driveway and the year of dissolution, was simply the mechanism by which that truth had made itself plain. The chapter closed, not with a crash, not with a verdict read in a courtroom or a final confrontation in a lit hallway, with the October light on a city's windows and a woman at a desk with a folder open and a photograph on her desk that was not the original, and that was, in every way that counted, exactly enough. With a man by a lake, writing in a notebook, getting slightly better at quiet, with the simple, unspectacular, absolute fact that some things, once burned, are gone, and that the fire that destroys them also, always, illuminates the hand that lit it, and that the woman who had stood and watched and said nothing had known that from the first moment and had been patient enough to let it be true.